It was supposed to be a night of laughter and joy, a celebration of milestones and memories. Friends gathered, drinks flowed, and the music played late into the evening. But when the sun rose the next day, only silence remained. What happened in those hours between dusk and dawn? What turned a moment of happiness into a scene of unimaginable terror? It was a night filled with anticipation, a celebration long overdue. Friends who hadn't seen each other in years gathered under one roof. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversations, the laughter that echoed into the night. It was perfect. Perfect until it wasn't. Somewhere between the toasts and the last song, something shifted. A silence too heavy for such a lively gathering crept in. One by one, smiles faded, replaced by unease. At first, it was subtle. A misplaced item, a flicker of lights, a door that wouldn't stay closed. But as the hours stretched, the air thickened, and the joy that filled the house turned into something far colder. By morning, the party was over. Not in the way anyone could have imagined, but in a way no one would ever forget. When the authorities arrived, they found the house eerily quiet, the music still faintly playing, and the remnants of what should have been a night of celebration, now stained in blood. It all began with an invitation, handwritten, elegant, and unexpected. The kind of invitation that instantly sparks curiosity and a sense of exclusivity. It was addressed to a small group of friends, each one hand-picked for reasons that were never entirely clear. The location: a sprawling countryside estate nestled far from the noise of the city. A place that carried whispers of old money and untold stories, its towering gates opening to a long, winding path that disappeared into the forest. For most of them, it was their first time seeing the estate in person, but the host, charming, charismatic, and somewhat enigmatic, had assured them it would be an unforgettable evening. They arrived in staggered pairs as twilight bathed the estate in hues of gold and violet. The laughter began almost immediately as old friends reunited and shared stories of the years gone by. The house, though grand and filled with ornate furnishings, carried an air of peculiar quiet. Not unsettling, at least not yet, but undeniably distinct. Its walls seemed to absorb sound, leaving conversations and music feeling muted, as if the house itself was listening. The host, ever the gracious figure, welcomed them with open arms, guiding them through the sprawling halls adorned with vintage portraits. Each face in those frames seemed to follow their movements. A trick of the light, they laughed, but some couldn't quite shake the unease. Still, the party began without a hitch. Drinks flowed freely, laughter echoed, and for a moment everything seemed like the perfect escape from the mundane routines of their lives. But even the closest of friends carry secrets, old wounds, hidden rivalries, and tensions that linger just below the surface. As the night wore on, small cracks began to show. A heated debate here, an awkward silence there, the kind of moments easily dismissed in the haze of celebration. Yet, there was something else, a strange sensation that gnawed at the edges of their awareness. It started with the little things. A misplaced jacket that turned up in another room entirely, a sudden draft in an otherwise sealed space, the faintest scent of smoke with no fire in sight. They laughed it off, chalking it up to the quirks of an old house. But the unease continued to grow. And then came the first inexplicable event. The power flickered, not unusual for a remote estate, but when it returned, one of the guests was gone. At first, no one panicked. They assumed it was a joke, a prank to heighten the thrill of the night. After all, they had been drinking, telling ghost stories, and reveling in the eerie ambiance of the old house. But as the minutes turned into hours, their attempts to find their missing friend became more desperate. And as they searched the vast halls and shadowed corners, it became clear they weren't alone in the house that night. As the search began, the mood shifted from casual concern to growing apprehension. The house, with its countless rooms and shadowy corridors, seemed to stretch endlessly, every turn revealing another unfamiliar space. What once felt grand and inviting now felt cold and overwhelming. The group decided to split up, reasoning that they'd cover more ground that way. Armed with flashlights and their phones, they called out for their missing friend, their voices echoing through the vast empty halls. But their calls went unanswered. Every room they entered told a different story. A dusty library filled with books that looked untouched for decades, a locked door that rattled as if something pressed against it from the other side, and a parlor with a grand piano that played a single dissonant note as one of them passed by. At first, they joked nervously, trying to shake off the growing tension. "She's probably hiding, trying to scare us," one of them said, but the laughter was hollow. Each of them carried an unspoken fear that this wasn't just a prank. As they moved deeper into the house, they began to notice strange details. A grandfather clock that had stopped at 11:57 p.m., a series of portraits lining the main staircase, each one featuring a figure whose face seemed just slightly wrong. And then there were the noises, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the sound of footsteps above them, though the second floor had been searched and found empty. Tensions among the group started to rise. Old arguments surfaced, fueled by the stress of the situation. One guest accused another of staging the disappearance as some kind of elaborate joke, while another insisted they leave the house immediately. But the host was firm. No one was leaving until their missing friend was found. She could be hurt, they reasoned. We can't just abandon her. But as the hours dragged on, fear began to outweigh reason. Some swore they'd seen shadows moving in the corners of their vision. Others claimed to hear their missing friend's voice calling out to them, but always from a different direction. One guest, visibly shaken, admitted they'd been hearing faint knocking sounds since the moment they'd arrived, but hadn't said anything because they didn't want to seem paranoid. And then came the discovery. In the corner of one of the guest rooms, they found her phone, screen cracked, smudged with what looked like blood. It was lying on the floor next to the bed, the sheets pulled back as if someone had been dragged from it. The group stared at the scene in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't a prank. Something was very, very wrong. Panic set in. Some wanted to call the police, but there was no signal. Others argued about heading out into the woods to find help, but the thick fog that had settled over the estate made the idea of leaving seem impossible. And then, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, save for the dim glow of their flashlights, and in that suffocating blackness they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. The darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing the house in silence and fear. Flashlights flickered as the group huddled together in the center of the room, their whispers urgent but disjointed. The footsteps they had heard moments earlier had stopped, but the air felt heavier, charged with an almost tangible dread. It started with a sound, soft at first, like the scratching of nails on wood. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Panic rippled through the group. One of them, unable to bear the suspense, shouted into the void, demanding answers. But what answered wasn't their missing friend. Instead, a low, guttural growl echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls and seeming to come from every direction at once. Chaos erupted. They stumbled through the halls, shouting each other's names, their flashlights bouncing wildly off the walls. In the commotion, one guest, the youngest of the group, became separated. Her panicked screams filled the air, but they were cut short just as quickly as they began. The others raced toward the sound, finding nothing but an empty corridor. On the floor lay her scarf, torn and stained with blood. Fear turned to desperation. They called out her name, their voices breaking, but the house responded with only silence. And then, for a moment, nothing happened. No sounds, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the old estate, until the laughter began. It was faint at first, like a child's giggle, distant and distorted. It echoed through the halls, growing louder and more warped, as though whoever or whatever was laughing was circling them. One of the guests, trembling, shouted for it to stop, only for the laughter to end abruptly, replaced by the sound of shattering glass. They turned to see one of the grand windows at the end of the hall had been broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. But there was something, or someone, standing just outside the window. A shadowed figure, motionless, its head tilted slightly as though watching them. The group froze, paralyzed by the sight, and then with unnatural speed, the figure vanished into the fog. The guests retreated to the main room, barricading the doors with whatever they could find. Their breathing was shallow, their nerves frayed. They whispered theories. Was it an intruder, a spirit, or something else entirely? But no answer made sense. Then came the pounding, heavy, deliberate knocks on the barricaded door. The wood trembled with each impact, the sound echoing through the house. One guest, unable to contain their fear, broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. But when they turned to comfort her, they realized she wasn't looking at the door. She was staring at the window behind them. Her trembling finger pointed toward the glass where, once again, the figure stood. This time it was closer, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. The group turned as one, but before they could react, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone, and the knocking ceased. In the sudden silence, they realized something horrifying. They weren't all accounted for. Another guest had vanished without a sound. Their belongings were still there. Coat, shoes, even their phone left on the table. But they were nowhere to be found. Panic gave way to despair. The group was dwindling one by one, and they had no way of knowing who or what was taking them. Determined to find answers, they ventured into the basement, the only place they hadn't yet searched. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they found an old iron door, slightly ajar, revealing a room lit by a single, flickering bulb. The walls were lined with strange symbols etched into the stone, and in the center of the room was a table. On it lay an old, leather-bound book, its pages open to a language none of them recognized. And then they heard it. A voice, low and distorted, speaking words they couldn't understand. It filled the room, rising and falling like a chant. The group turned to flee, but the iron door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. They were trapped. The chanting grew louder, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. The group huddled together, their fear reaching a fever pitch as the room seemed to close in around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The voice, the light, the glowing symbols, it all disappeared, plunging the room into darkness once again. But in that darkness, they weren't alone. The darkness in the basement was absolute, swallowing every flicker of light. For a moment, the group was frozen, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming silence. The air was thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. And then, without warning, the room came alive with sound, whispers layered upon whispers, overlapping in a chaotic, unintelligible murmur. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. One of the guests screamed, shining their flashlight wildly in every direction. The beam caught something on the wall, movement, a shadow that slithered unnaturally, as though it were alive. The whispers grew louder, and the shadow began to take form, stretching and twisting until it resembled a figure. But the shape was wrong, elongated, distorted, and utterly inhuman. The group bolted for the door, pounding and clawing at the iron barrier, but it refused to budge. Behind them, the shadow began to move, slowly at first, then with startling speed. One guest, consumed by panic, turned to confront it, screaming incoherently, their flashlight trembling in their hand. But the light flickered and died, plunging the room into even deeper darkness. Their scream was cut short, replaced by the sound of something being dragged away. The others didn't look back. They pressed against the door, pushing and pulling with all their strength until it finally gave way. They stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind them. For a moment, they felt a glimmer of relief, but it was short-lived. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, spreading through the entire house like an unseen force was chasing them. They ran blindly through the halls, their flashlights barely illuminating the path ahead. The house, which had already seemed unnervingly vast, now felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Doors they thought led to familiar rooms now opened into spaces they didn't recognize, endless corridors, empty ballrooms, and staircases that spiraled into nothingness. As they fled, they began to notice things that didn't make sense. The portraits on the walls, they were changing. Faces that had once been stoic and lifeless now seemed to writhe and contort, their eyes following the group's every move. One of the guests stopped, staring at a particular painting, their voice trembling as they whispered, "That's me." Before anyone could respond, the canvas seemed to ripple, and the figure in the painting smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin. The house itself seemed alive, feeding off their fear. Doors slammed shut on their own, locking them in or out of rooms. Windows that should have led to the outside now revealed only darkness, or worse, faint glimpses of something moving just beyond the glass. The floorboards creaked as if someone, or something, was following them. Though whenever they turned, the hallway was empty. Their numbers were dwindling, each disappearance more sudden and horrifying than the last. One guest was swallowed by the floor itself, the wooden planks splitting open like a mouth and dragging them down before snapping shut again. Another vanished after stepping through a door that immediately sealed behind them, their screams echoing faintly before fading into silence. Eventually, only two remained, the host and one of the guests. Exhausted, bloodied, and barely able to stand, they stumbled into the dining hall, the place where the night had begun. The grand table was still set, the candles burning low, but the once pristine tablecloth was now stained with blood, and the chairs that had once seated their friends were empty, save for the faint impressions left behind, as if the guests were still sitting there in some invisible form. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single deafening roar, and then silence. The host turned to the guest, their face pale, their voice trembling. "This isn't my house," they confessed. "I don't know who invited us here." The words hung in the air, heavy and horrifying. Before the guest could respond, the chandelier above them shattered, raining glass and fire. The flames illuminated the room, revealing the truth. The walls were covered in those same strange symbols they'd seen in the basement, now glowing with an otherworldly light. And standing at the head of the table was the shadow, fully formed, its twisted figure towering over them. The guest screamed, but no sound came out. The shadow reached for them, its elongated fingers stretching impossibly far. The host tried to run, but the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The last thing the guests saw before everything went dark was the shadow's face, or what passed for a face, distorted and filled with an indescribable malice. By morning, the house stood silent, as though the events of the previous night had never occurred. The fog that had cloaked the estate dissipated, revealing a building that appeared untouched by chaos. But within, there was no sign of the guests or their host. The dining hall, the basement, every room, all empty. The only traces left behind were scattered belongings, a scarf, a torn piece of fabric, and a phone with a cracked screen lying on the grand staircase. Authorities were called, though there was little they could do. The house had a reputation, a history shrouded in rumors and half-forgotten stories. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds and flickering lights, but no one had dared to venture inside. Those who did were often drifters, thrill-seekers, or the curious. None stayed long, and few spoke of what they encountered. One investigator, compelled by the disappearance, spent days combing through the property. He discovered the basement door ajar, leading to the room where the group had found the strange book. The symbols on the walls were gone, and the table was empty. But the investigator noticed something peculiar. The floor in the center of the room seemed disturbed, as though something had been buried or unearthed. Digging revealed nothing but layers of old wood and stone. Yet, as he worked, he claimed to feel eyes on him, an oppressive presence that grew heavier the longer he stayed. Eventually, overcome by an unshakable fear, he fled the house, leaving his tools behind. As word spread about the disappearance, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed the house was cursed, built on land tied to ancient rituals. Others whispered about the original owner, a recluse who had vanished decades ago, leaving the estate to decay. His journals, found years later, detailed strange experiments and rituals meant to connect with the afterlife. But no one could confirm the truth, and the journals themselves were said to have disappeared, stolen, lost, or destroyed. And then there were the theories. Those who believed in the supernatural pointed to the glowing symbols and the voices that the survivors swore they heard. Others argued it was a psychological experiment gone wrong, orchestrated by a hidden puppet master. Some insisted the entire event was a mass hallucination brought on by something in the air or the water. But the most unsettling theory came from a local historian who had studied the house for years. She claimed the estate was a living entity, feeding off the energy of those who entered. "It doesn't let people leave," she said in a chilling interview. "Not entirely. Pieces of them stay behind." Her words were dismissed by many as the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist, but to those who knew the house, they rang true. To this day, the estate remains abandoned, its windows dark and its halls silent. But passers-by report strange occurrences, flickering lights, faint laughter, and shadows moving just beyond the curtains. Some claim to hear their own names whispered in the wind, as though the house is calling to them. The guests and their host were never found. Their families searched for answers, but time and distance dulled the urgency. Eventually, the case was closed, marked as unsolved, though it was never forgotten. And the house remains, waiting for its next visitors, its next story to tell. What you've just heard is one of the most chilling stories we've ever uncovered. But the mysteries of the world are endless, and the shadows are always hiding more tales to tell. What do you think really happened to the guests that night? Was it a paranormal encounter, a psychological experiment gone wrong, or something we can't even begin to understand? Share your theories in the comments below. We're dying to hear them. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more terrifying tales, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us continue creating content that keeps you on the edge of your seat. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for weekly dives into the most haunting mysteries, unexplained events, and stories that make you question what's real. Want more chills? Check out our playlist of haunted encounters and eerie investigations by clicking here. And if you know of a story we should cover, let us know in the comments or connect with us on social media. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't just stories. Stay safe and stay curious.